You are watching the 7th Annual Caribbean Sustainable Energy Forum. Live from the Hilton Resort in Barbados, welcome to the 7th Annual Caribbean Sustainable Energy Forum. It's time for Session 3 entitled Enabling Implementation, Information Management, Integrated Planning and Project Development. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Session 3 of the Caribbean Sustainable Energy Forum. This morning, I have the pleasure of introducing our session chair, Dr. Armstrong Alexis. Dr. Alexis, St. Lucian by birth, holds a doctoral degree in Business Administration from Walden University, an MBA from the University of Durham, and a Master's in Sociology and Bachelor's of Science in Social Work from the UWI Mona campus. Dr. Alexis recently joined the CARICOM Secretariat and has oversight for corporate services and functional management under delegated responsibility from the CARICOM Secretary General. Throughout his career, Dr. Alexis has held numerous leadership positions, both as a volunteer and professionally. Just as an example, he has served as Deputy Resident Representative of the United Nations Development Programme, Namibia Country Office. Dr. Alexis has also served as Regional Director for the Commonwealth Youth Programme in the Caribbean. He has considerable experience in public sector at senior levels with the Government of St. Lucia and in academia with the University of West Indies, Mona campus in Jamaica. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome Dr. Armstrong Alexis, Deputy Secretary General of the CARICOM Secretariat.
Well, thank you very much for this introduction, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, all those of you who are following us online this morning. It is a pleasure to be here to chair this session and subsequently to moderate the panel discussion to follow. The theme for this session, as was indicated earlier, is enabling implementation, information management, and integrated planning and project development. Ladies and gentlemen, from across the Caribbean and beyond, this is an extremely pertinent topic. And we have an eminent panel of presenters to help us navigate the topic. They span the landscape of private and public sectors, scholarship, and practice, and are all in a position to explain to us the implications, ramifications, and the opportunities that attend this particular topic. I have no doubt that these individuals will help us better understand the issues that confront us, and by the end of the session, our intention is to have some very practical recommendations for implementation. I therefore start by asking my first panel my first panelist or discussant to come on board. And as the discussants help us navigate the topics, I will ask them to contextualize their presentations by first and foremost telling us a little about themselves, perhaps in 30 seconds, and then to engage in the topic at hand. Our first presenter, therefore, is Mr. Gareth Davis, and I invite Gareth to address us. Over to you, Gareth.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and I'd like to thank the CARICOM Secretariat for inviting me here from Scotland. So Scotland and the Orkney Islands are not part of the Caribbean, as you well know, but we've had a long association with CARICOM and with the work that has gone on in these islands. My own background is as a marine biologist, so the seas and the energy of the seas is something I'm really interested in. And in the islands where I live and have lived for the last 30 years, we've made great strides in harnessing the energy from these waters, and what we've then done is shared that experience with other places in the world. And I was delighted to be in Grenada 3 years ago, talking with all of you in person. This time it's a little bit different, but I hope to be able to explain some of the changes and developments that have taken place over the last few years. So what I want to do first of all is talk through, if I can get my slides to move on, no, here we go, is just introduce the Orkney Islands to you. So the islands, as you can see here, are on the north end of the British Isles, and you'll notice that the map is reversed, so we're looking down from the north to the south because that's the perspective we have on the world. And these islands are home to 22,000 people, so quite a small archipelago of people, but they've had a major endeavor to harness the wind, wave, and tidal resources of the islands, and that's led to a significant investment in capacity. It's led to significant monetary investment over the years, and that's led to technological advancement and the delivery of clean, green energy. So what I'd like to do now is show you some of those developments. Now, development doesn't happen in a vacuum. So the Orkney Islands are many things to many people. It's a home to people. It's a place where people come to visit on holiday. And it's also a place where industry and technology have developed new technologies and deployed those technologies. So you can see here some of the landscapes that characterize Orkney, but also some of the technologies that have been adopted within that landscape. And in terms of energy systems, what we've done is embrace the full gamut of energy. So it starts from generation and goes all the way through, as you can see here, to the use of energy in its very different ways. And we look at all the different forms of energy. So we look at electricity, we look at transportation, and we also look at heating and cooling services. And as well as those things, we look at the commoditization of energy into products that we can then export to other parts of the world. And we look at how energy flows can influence that. So the islands can become a hub to which energy is drawn and from which energy is exported. So when we think about energy systems, we need to think about all of these systems and the services that are associated with it. And some of you may remember that I presented this slide 3 years ago, and basically the message here is that we see the world as a series of individual energy markets. Each square kilometer on Earth has its own energy characteristics that are different from the square that's next to it. So the resources, the infrastructure, the types of energy use that are needed in a particular place, they all differ from place to place. And so what we've done in our work within Orkney over the years is try to celebrate that diversity and look for solutions that are appropriate for each of the places that exist around the world. And these 4 pictures perhaps show an example of that point. So in each of these communities, there's a need for energy, but the type of energy they need, perhaps how much they can afford to pay for that energy, and how that energy gets used will differ between each of those communities. And so as we talk, and I present today about the solutions we found in Orkney, these are not solutions that can then just be packaged up and taken somewhere else. We need to think about what are the things that we can learn from, what can we use elsewhere, and what do we need to discard. So, like many parts of the world, Orkney has been through an incredible change and faces incredible change over the next few years. So we've had political change and things like Brexit, things like the independence referendum for Scotland. We then had the pandemic. And looking forward, we've got the climate emergency, we've got infrastructure developments, we've got changes in the demographics of our communities, and the global cycles of financial boom and bust cycles. So all of these agents of change are things that we have to work within as a community. And so as much as talking about energy, I'm also going to be talking about change management and how we handle that change. And instead of being scared of it, how can we embrace it and make change work for us as island communities? And so one of the ways that we've done this in Orkney is to work together. And collaboration and the collective endeavor is something that I think is very important and we'll probably come on to in the panel session. And what we've done locally is create a cluster of businesses, of organizations across the academic, the business, the community and governance sectors, which are basically all driven by the mission of decarbonizing our local economy within Orkney and making a contribution to wider world decarbonization. And that endeavor has now grown to the fact that we have over 350 people working in the blue economy sector. We've got another 250 people working on different forms of energy. And we have a maritime sector who are becoming increasingly involved in energy, as you'll see, of about 600 people. So all in all, we have perhaps 1,000 people out of the 22,000 people in the islands that are already relevant to the energy opportunities and challenges that we have. So that's a great resource to build from. And alongside that, there's been an incredible monetary investment that's gone on as well. So if you look at the last 20 years within Orkney, there's been something like £1 billion invested in energy technology, energy infrastructure, investigations that support energy developments. And all of that money hasn't just come from other places. A third of that, £300 million, has come from the Orkney community, from the businesses, from the local government, and other interested parties to drive that investment. So it's about human capital and it's about monetary capital and mobilizing those two things together. Now, as well as having those assets, we need to also have a plan. And one of the things that is really important to drive out the fear and uncertainty from this proposition is to have different plans that perhaps look at different possible scenarios and then to engage our communities and our stakeholders in the discussion about which of these scenarios would be preferred and best to follow. And here's an example of some suitability mapping activities that have been done in Orkney to try and choose the best places to put particular infrastructure. And that kind of infrastructure for us started with wind. So you can see here the trend over time since 2012 in terms of wind output in Orkney. And that green oval on the side of the page there indicates the time when Orkney became self-sufficient in electrical energy. So since 2013, over 100% of our electrical output has come from renewable sources. So that's a great source of pride to everybody on the islands. But what's remarkable, and you'll see here on this diagram, that electricity demand only represents 15% of our total energy stack. So we've done about 15% of the good job. We've got another 85% to do, which means then that we can decarbonize the rest of the hydrocarbon use that we have in our system, predominantly around transportation and heating. And I'm going to touch on some of that in the presentation. So something that Orkney is very famous for is that we're home to the European Marine Energy Centre. And that centre is the world's biggest and first marine test centre for wave and tidal technology. And over the years, we've now tested over 50 different technology types and models in the waters of Orkney. And those technologies have, in some cases, gone on to be successful and deployed in other places. Unfortunately, because it's a test center, some of those technologies haven't been successful, but that's the nature of innovation. We are seeing progress being made. And some of the greatest successes are in relation to tidal power. And this machine, the orbital machine, what's special about that is it was actually invented and designed in Orkney. So this tidal machine, which is the most powerful one in the world, was designed in our islands, it was tested in our islands, and now it's being deployed to generate energy in our islands. But there are other technologies that are also being tested in Orkney as well. We also have had success on wave power, and although we don't have homegrown technologies, we've been able to play host to different technologies from different places. And here you can see the Wello Oi machine from Finland, which we know from announcements yesterday is something that Barbados is interested in, but there are other technologies that can also play a role in different wave regimes around the world. But generating power isn't enough. What we also need to do is think about how we store and handle the energy that we've generated. And so increasingly around the world, you'll hear people talk about hydrogen and the use of hydrogen as an energy storage vector. And this is something that Orkney embraced about 7 or 8 years ago. And you can see here on the map that the islands of Ede and Shappensea are linked to the mainland through a network of hydrogen infrastructure that delivers gaseous hydrogen to the mainland, where it can be used to help with ferry transport, with vehicle transport, and with thermal demand in buildings. But that hydrogen journey is really just the start. So what we're now starting to do is look at how hydrogen can be used across the shipping fleet and look at different systems that allow us to design ships, as you can see here, whether they're ferries, whether they're workboats, or whether they're fishing boats. They're all driven by engines that have the same chemistry. Now, it's really difficult at the moment to say exactly what chemistry is going to drive these vessels in the future, and it may be a mixture of them. So what we're looking to do is to standardize the power production units within ship design so that any system can fit any ship. Not content with the ships, we're an archipelago of islands. We have 17 islands, and therefore air links are really important to us. And so, as we all know, flight is becoming a kind of bad word, but in the Caribbean, your economies rely on flight as much as our economy does in Orkney. So we need to make that a challenge that we can overcome. And so the way we're doing it is to look at electrical flights, look at hydrogen-fueled flights and hybrid-fueled flights. And we have 4 airplanes that are due to be tested in Orkney over the coming months, hopefully with passenger services starting next year. So if we've got to the stage where flight becomes decarbonized, that's a great milestone that we can take forward. And as we look a bit further afield, close to Orkney, about 50 kilometers to the southeast, we have quite a large offshore wind farm. But what's interesting, and I'll show you in a few slides now, is the way in which this is likely to grow in the future. And underpinning this is the infrastructure. So we've got port and harbor infrastructure that we need to think about as well. So, as well as that infrastructure, what we're also doing is looking at the way in which we use energy as a community. And we've started a project called Reflex, which is to design and deliver an integrated energy system of the future based on digitally connecting the different sources of generation and demand. And what's interesting, when we look at our use of energy as a community, is the amount of money that we spend on that. So basically, we spend around £200 million a year in Orkney amongst the 22,000 people, not just on the fuel and the electrons that give us the energy, but on the technology that use those forms of energy as well. So I think that's an important figure to think about, because in the energy transition, we're not just thinking about inventing new money. This is money that we're spending in our communities every week, every month, every year, and what we're trying to do is redirect that to be spent in the right way that helps us decarbonize. So to help that, we've focused on transport. Having, if you like, solved the electrical generation side, our next challenge is transport. And one of the things we're majoring on is electric vehicles, and so we have a fleet of test vehicles that people can come and drive. And what we found is that 1 out of 2 people that sit in an electric car then want to lease one and use one. So it's a really high conversion rate. So there's a lesson there. If we want people to adopt EVs, get them to sit in one, try it, and they'll take it on. And we've also established Reflex as a membership entity, so you can join Reflex Orkney as a resident and then get all of the services associated with decarbonisation, not just EVs, but looking at household battery systems, looking at smart heating systems, and in future looking at how we can integrate hydrogen into that system. So just to touch briefly on the opportunity and the role that Orkney can play in the wider energy system of the UK. Like any other part of the world, and with COP26 ringing in our ears, there's commitments that people have made to decarbonise their energy systems. In the UK, it means we probably need about 150 gigawatts of new renewable energy by 2045. And most of that energy, we think, is going to come from the north of Britain within those yellow circles that you've seen there. So as an island, we're looking to prepare ourselves for how we can play a role to effectively be a host and a hub for that level of potential, 150 gigawatts. So one of the things that we need to be able to do is to handle perhaps 10,000 wind turbines that are going to be built and deployed over that next 20 or so years. And to do that, we're looking at developing a floating port as a new piece of infrastructure, which is illustrated here, and this will sit in a body of water that we call Scapa Flow. Now this port, as you can see there, Scapa Flow is a big enclosed area of water. The orange shape there represents the harbour infrastructure, and that will provide 14 kilometres of quayside space for assembling and deploying these turbines. Now, alongside that, we're going to need fuel for the ships that are taking these turbines to sea, and the local oil terminal has now announced plans to convert itself to a hydrogen production facility, possibly with ammonia and methanol in it as well. So these are really tangible steps that are being taken on the island to not only deal with renewable production, but to actually effect a transition in our oil and gas infrastructure. And in another area that we're looking at is to act as a hub for as the Arctic ice melts as a consequence of climate change, looking at the trade routes that are going to open across the Arctic and how we can adapt and serve a purpose there. So all of this, as I said at the start, we've spent £1 billion on our energy infrastructure to date, but all of this that I've talked about and shown you is going to take new money. And so when we've done the sums and looked at all the ways that we need to upgrade our housing, upgrade our transport, create new local infrastructure, the total cost for an island group like Orkney is about £3 billion. And for the neighbouring islands of Shetland and the Western Isles, another $3 billion each. But that's not all the investment that's going to take place, because I mentioned the offshore wind side, and beyond that wind farm that I showed you, there's another 10 wind farms that are now being planned, and we think they'll have a spend of around £20 billion. So that would take us up to perhaps 10 gigawatts of installed potential. But of course, I mentioned the 150 gigawatts, and this is what the ultimate solution looks like. For us to decarbonize in the UK, we probably need to spend around £150 billion in and around the islands of Orkney over the next 25 years. So it's not just about having the ideas and the talent and the resources, it's about being able to manage our way through an incredibly intense investment in energy infrastructure going forward. Is it worth it? Well, it has to be worth it, because we have to decarbonize. There is no choice. We don't have another world to leap to. So the islands in the north of Scotland have the potential to generate somewhere between 20 and 50% of UK's total energy capacity, and that's the endeavour that we're engaged in. So just some final thoughts then. How is this relevant from Europe, from Scotland, from Orkney to the Caribbean? Well, one of the things that I'm always reminded of is that although you have a very neat pattern of archipelagic islands, in Europe we have a similar diversity of islands. They're just spread in a slightly different way, but each of those circles will represent either island communities or island nations in both areas. So we both have these groups of islands. This slide shows for Orkney the links of our supply chain. All of the activities that I showed you have suppliers in Orkney, but we have suppliers all over Europe and indeed the world. So if you look at our supply line chains, that red lines represent our supply chain. So if you superimpose that scale for scale, it's exactly the same scale into the Caribbean. It shows that any island within the Caribbean is going to rely on a supply chain that spreads the whole of the Caribbean. So we're not working in isolation here, we're actually working together in a collective. And that's also emphasized by this slide, which shows the cabling that exists already in Europe and in the Caribbean. And you can see that cabling between the islands is not new or a problem. It's what we have already for telecommunications. So we need to think about how that's going to be delivered in the future, how we can upgrade that with power infrastructure that joins all these nations together. So this is a slide that I'm smiling because I actually made this up for 3 years ago in Grenada, and it was a message that was given from somebody in the Caribbean about the need not to change the mindset, but to change minds. We can't avoid mindset. The amount of challenge and change we need to take on is immense. And we were reminded at that meeting that this isn't really a technology challenge, it's a challenge of the mentality and the collaboration and our willingness to commit to change. And you can see there I've bolded the 3 words, collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. That is the most important thing for me out of this. If we don't collaborate, if we don't work together, we're not going to be able to manage this. And so the future actions that may help are pretty standard things, really. We need to understand what's going on. We need to be able to predict and manage what that looks like in terms of markets. We need to be aware of the options that are available to us. And then we need to support and invest in appropriate solutions and in our local communities. We need to create strong capacity to manage that and to be able to, for people to understand that, we need to raise awareness. And then we need to monitor how we're doing in terms of the targets that we've set and be able to adapt when things go wrong and do more of it when they go right and report back to the stakeholders we've got. So this is our lessons, if you like, from our Orkney experience. I hope they're a good start to today's activities, and I look forward to the discussions that follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gareth, for this presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, you would recognize that despite the fact that Gareth is coming from a small island part of Europe, much of what he has said relates to the Caribbean. So whilst you ponder on the issues and await the next presenter, may I invite those of you who are following us online to consider taking the virtual the virtual questionnaire that we have. There are a number of questions that are there presented. Also, you are welcome to share some thoughts with us, and there will be a response to your thoughts. All of this happening online, and we also invite you to share with your friends and family the fact that they can follow this entire proceeding online at CEM2021caricom.org. I now call upon our next presenter, Mr. David Farrell. David has decided to practice what he is convinced of, that the virtual world is just as enabling and as practical as the physical world, and David has decided to join us virtually to bring some practice to what we have been preaching, certainly since the advent of COVID. Over to you, David Farrell.
Dr. Alexis, I wish I was trying to practice functioning in the virtual world. It's just that I have another commitment immediately following, so it's a bit more practical to actually work from my office rather than miss the other commitment. So I do apologize for not being present in the studio, but nevertheless, I will endeavor to try to provide a presentation that I think is interesting. You had asked that we talk briefly about ourselves, so I will go and say that I'm a geoscientist. I have an undergraduate degree in geophysics, master's and PhD in hydrogeology, which is kind of interesting. I spent post-PhD years, 8 years in the United States, working on building a nuclear waste repository at Yucca Mountain as a hydrologist or hydrogeologist, but also working in geophysics and a number of other areas, which include a lot of data and analysis. And certainly building a lot of skill outside of my core areas of competence. And so that is kind of where I come from. And but I can go on and say that certainly I've been at CIMH for the last 15 years. And one of the things that we try to do is to transform the Institute away from just being a training institution to being more research and development, innovation type organization. So I just want to put that on the table. And certainly we do a lot of work with a lot of young people in terms of trying to build the next generation of scientists and innovators in the region. Let me start the presentation by saying certainly that data forms the cornerstone of all of our decisions. How we manipulate data determines the information we take from it and ultimately the decisions we make. And so data by itself is not particularly informative. It is really what we do with it that really generates significant value to society. With regards to the Institute, we have been exploring opportunities with the energy sector over the last few years. Certainly, we see significant value in mapping weather and climate information into the weather system, the energy systems in the region, especially as many of these energy systems transition into weather climate-based renewables. And so we see a significant partnership with CCRI and the CARICOM Secretariat emerging, where we provide data and information that supports the energy sector. And in this regard, we've worked with the energy sector in terms of looking at the building out the IRRP program that the CCRI and the CARICOM Secretariat have been working on. As well, we've looked at a number of other areas as part of our whole climate services program in terms of looking at the provision of energy and climate services, climate services for the energy sector and the health sector, agriculture sector, water sector, hotel and tourism sector. We see all of this as being part of a interconnected ecosystem of services. And so one service also provides benefit from one sector to another sector. So I will start by going through my presentation. So we certainly live in the what we call the global information age, where timely access to accurate data and information to risk-inform our levels of decision-making is now becoming extremely essential. I don't think there is a day that goes by when we're not looking for information somewhere to inform a decision. The problem that most of us probably now are suffering from is too much information with regards to making a decision. And I think that that becomes the overdetermined problem, where you're trying to piece together all the information, you still can't make a decision. That really is unique to the situation that you're looking at. You're overwhelmed. But if the Caribbean is to become globally competitive in the information age, it must transform the way it, one, collects, quality assures, stores, and distributes data. This is fundamental. And this is one of the things that the Institute is working through and has been working through for years, is to really work through that with regards to weather and climate data. It also has to look at the way it integrates, transforms data into useful products and services. I once worked on a large data set in the United States. We built a wonderful product. The interesting thing about that wonderful product is that nobody ever used it because it was not particularly useful to the people that we intended that product to serve, and because we never interacted with them fully to really understand what it is they really wanted from the product. But we must address issues of data ownership. This is perhaps one of the biggest challenges now in the region, is the ownership of data and whether I get access to your data or you get access to my data. But one of the fundamental challenges is data sitting on shelves. And so we have warehoused data. We have data that sits on shelves, it sits in databases, it racks up storage costs, but it is not generating revenue. And that, to me, is one of the fundamental problems that we have with data in the region. Certainly, access to timely data is going to drive innovative solutions and entrepreneurship that transforms the region. But the question is really, do we understand what that transformation is that we want and how to use data to get to that endpoint? We certainly are seeing it in societies where data is a lot more open. I put the figure up on the right-hand side because I came across this figure and it was kind of interesting because it talks about we're moving into the computation and information age, and it goes through the different energy transformation energy approaches. But certainly, I believe that there's still significant opportunity now as we look to restructure the whole energy system in response to climate change. And perhaps there should be another curve or category in there which deals with renewables in some way, shape, form, or fashion. So, as I pointed out, a significant amount of data really exists for the Caribbean region. I don't think that the issue really is whether there's a lot of data. It is really that a significant portion of that data is inaccessible for various reasons. Some of it is on written records and not yet converted to electronic formats. And so we need more data capture initiatives in the region to really convert that information into useful, that information into something useful. Certainly the Institute has worked on some of this in terms of the climate data, in terms of rescuing climate data. The electronic data often exists, but the owners are willing to make it accessible outside of their institutions. This is really endemic in the region. I know you have it, but I'm not necessarily going to give it to you, or you're not necessarily going to give it to me. Inadequate data transfer systems exist. But what happens when the data is readily available or is available? We also have common and agreed data standards don't exist. And so I may have a data set, you may have a need for it, but it doesn't work for you without significant effort. This is a problem. And I think this problem came up really as well during my years in the US, especially 9/11, where all the emergency systems and all the different players in 9/11 were using different data formats, or a lot of different data formats anyways. And it took a while to straighten that out. And so eventually people started to move to more common data standards. And while data may be accessible, it is not in readily usable media. I have a ton of zip drives in my possession. I also have data on microfiche. It is not particularly useful. In fact, I had to go find a zip drive somewhere in the world. It took a long time to find one for the purposes of what I needed. And so this is a problem. But the other thing is the cost of data, and data at times can be extremely expensive. And so it is time that the government start to embrace open data formats. And this is going to be one of the defining challenges of this region in the coming decade, is how to agree on open data formats and who should participate in open data structures. But there are a number of enabling requirements. Certainly capacity development is required. We need IT infrastructure that also supports the whole issue of moving data around and turning data into information. But I want to go back to capacity development, because that is an area that I think we need to integrate the new data science and informatics skills into our work with data. Certainly data and information portals do exist, but data sharing, quality management systems, and interportal connectivity agreements are required. Data integration and decision support platforms, there aren't many that actually do a really good job at data integration and turning that integration into useful information for decision support systems. It is one of the things that we are working on. But we have a lot of transforming technologies, and these are evolving quickly. We talk about big data and data lakes. We talk about artificial intelligence, neural networks, machine learning, and deep learning. We also are collecting a lot of data now through industrial Internet of Things technologies. They're cheap embedded sensors that are delivering significant amounts of information. And we have migrated in the region to advanced data visualization, not on the level that that is required, but certainly we have started doing AR, VR, and other types of advanced visualization. But the problem is always going to be implementing appropriate security and governance arrangements to manage all of this. This slide is a little bit more complicated. It talks more about multi-hazard early warning systems, but it is really just a structure for data integration that can be used for the energy sector or any sector. And we collect hazard information, we collect socioeconomic information and vulnerability information. And in the energy sector, there may be other data sets that are also use infrastructural data, et cetera. And we try to fuse that together through data ingestion processes, modeling, scenario development, and risk analysis. And this goes back to the previous slide where we start using the new technologies to really support this type of data fusion. And the outcome is really a decision or support for decision. Within the data fusion process, we can start talking about risk matrices, potential impacts and likelihoods, and we can start looking at risk levels and response actions. Again, this is a standard structure that can be applied to the energy sector, it can be applied to any sector, disaster management, and so on. But certainly we need sustained quality assured data and management to support enhanced risk assessments. Systems should be capable of supporting rapid unbiased assessments of potential scenarios to identify risk levels and associated prioritize mitigative actions. And the key thing is that we need to be able to communicate these rapidly, but in a manner that makes sense to people who will receive the information. And as I pointed out, within this type of structure, we have room for big data, AI, and advanced data visualization. Again, it is really whether the region wants to take on this type of a challenge with its data structures. But as I point out, communicating risk and proposed mitigative actions is really critical to this. How we communicate and share actionable information is essential. This is just an example from a platform that we at CIMH use called WebAlert. And within the WebAlert, this is now an automated workflow from our data ingestion platforms to our modeling platforms, and know how we push that information out in a targeted way to people who need the information. Not everyone needs the same information. And certainly within the utility space, not everyone requires the same information at the same time. People in different geographic areas require different types of information that meets their need at that particular location at that time. And so we have integrated this whole process to be able to visualize the impacts. And as you can see in the circle or the ellipse that is shown, we can automatically generate proposed actions within those geographic spaces. Similarly, this can be done for the energy sector. But with all ICT systems, cybersecurity is essential throughout the entire process. And that is really where, again, the rubber hits the road. What are our security protocols to ensure that the information that is being delivered is accurate and credible? And it is something that we are working on as we go forward to strengthen our platforms to make sure that we can survive the hacks and make sure that the quality of that information that we store and that we disseminate is useful. We can build similar platforms for the energy sector through the IRP process, as I mentioned before. So I just want to end my talk here and thank you for the time to listen. And certainly, if you have any questions about anything that I've spoken about, you can certainly send me an email and I would certainly try to respond to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David Farrell, for your contributions there. I think as Caribbean people, we fully recognize the challenges that this region faces when it comes to the issue of data, access to data, how we collect, how we store, how we use data in policymaking in particular. Colleagues, as I welcome our next speaker to the podium, Dr. Gary Jackson, an individual who you all heard from during the opening session. As I invite Gary to the stage, can I invite those of you who are following us online to please take the poll. There is a question here which intrigues me very much, and that is, what is the number one reason for pursuing a renewable energy agenda within the Caribbean? Is it to lower the cost of energy? Is it to improve energy security? Is it to increase energy access? Is it to improve energy system reliance to external shocks? Or is it to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sector? And your last option, to create jobs and stimulate economic growth. We invite you online to please take the poll and also pose your questions to the participants, the presenters here today. And before the end of this session, your questions will be answered. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now time to introduce to you once again Dr. Gary Jackson, who will take us through the next presentation. Over to you, Gary.
Thank you very much, DSG. Good morning, all. Just introduce myself, Gary Jackson. I'm an engineer. All of my degrees were in engineering based on my mother's instructions. So I'm considered a good boy doing that. So you would have heard from my colleagues, earlier, one of the things we're looking at is how we integrate systems, given our local context. That is going to be very important. But also, the data that we receive is going to be very important to inform that context. Garbage in, garbage out. So we have to ensure that we have good data quality to support the work that we do. So this is where it starts. I'm sold on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and I hope you are too. This is what we are trying to achieve as a globe. And in the Caribbean, we are trying to play our part in navigating this landscape. In particular, number 7 is one of the areas that we're looking at. Number 11, number 5 is obviously of importance to drive our agenda to make sure that we have equity and equality. Number 13 is also important, and as we know, for 14, is that we recognize that we are ocean states, most of us, and we have to see how best we can explore that blue economy that we so desire. So, moving from there, critical to what we do is our people. Who are they? They are farmers, they are businessmen, they are in the tourist sectors, they are bartenders, they are children going to school, and they have instances where people do not have electricity in Suriname, in Belize, in Haiti, in Guyana. And how do we provide energy access to the most vulnerable groups? Because that is where our focus is as well. So, what has happened to us over the years? We are vulnerable. We have intensive and extensive damage to our systems. The hurricane season is ending November 30th, but with all that is happening, we see changes. It may extend beyond November. We can see at that top photo, is just looking at what would happen in Dominica when Maria hit them. We had some serious rainfalls in Jamaica, and this is not a hurricane, this was just rainfall, and we saw saturation hitting a number of the land areas and pole lines are collapsing. We looked at St. Vincent, and you saw that volcanic eruption and what Barbados experienced when that happened, and we understand our vulnerability. We saw the Sahara dust coming across. Some of you may not realize how hazy it was a number of times during the year, and that was the Sahara dust, and we see what impact that will bring to our solar production. Flooding in Guyana. Guyana is known for that. As a matter of fact, Georgetown is below sea level, and they have what they call a seawall that protects them. And that is a very vulnerable as our sea level rises. So we recognize all these challenges in the climate aspect, and that is why we came across the Integrated Resource and Resilience Plan. Key to this is managing and engaging our stakeholders. Our stakeholders are wide and vast. But it's important to engage our stakeholders in setting up what we call a fit-for-purpose Integrated Resource and Resilience Plan. So universities, manufacturers, civil society, the tourist governments, everybody needs to be all hands on deck. And we have heard it from our international partners, we have heard it from the CARICOM Secretariat, and we have heard it from governments that we recognize that this is going to be a collaboration. As my colleague Garrett said, collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. So we need to engage our stakeholders. So let us look at what we're dealing with. Let us look at our demand profile for countries. You'll note we have literally kind of two peaks. One during the day and one at night. Interestingly, the night one is the highest one. And what does that tell us about us in the Caribbean? Is that we are actually using more energy when we are maybe producing less. So we are home, turning on televisions, turning on lights, and maybe having a few parties in the tourist sector. So it is going to be important for us to manage that energy use. So energy efficiency is critical to the Integrated Resource and Resilience Plan. So I wanted to make sure that was very clear for us. So let us look at how we are using energy, and let us do an overlay of one of the resources that we are looking into very keenly. Let's just look at solar. So solar, as we know, we're using the light energy from the sun. We call it photons. That is incident on these panels that you will see on roofs. And you have heard James Husband in our opening telling you the difference between, and I think Barbados was also on radio, telling the difference between solar thermal and solar PV. So this is solar PV, photovoltaics. So look at what is happening. It's peaking in the day when we have the lower peak. So what happens after? So I've actually created a solar system that is big enough to meet one of the peaks. But we realize we still have a deficiency on either side of that curve. So let us help it with something else. And this is just illustrative. Let us add wind. So we add some wind to meet the same demand, and we still have some deficiencies. And what this is telling us, we recognize, based on our local context, that different resources is going to give us different things. So as the minister said, we recognize, and I think a number of the governments have recognized it, we have to use a diversified strategy. So we know that we have to look at different resources, and we know we are looking at ocean energy, we're looking at geothermal that can provide base load, and we're looking at hydro as well in some countries. So we have to understand what resources you have, and it goes back to data. We have to collect the right set of data to understand these resources are proven and are bankable so that we can deploy those technologies. So in understanding the plan, once we understand the resources you have, we understand the need of energy. You know, when I show you that load profile, we now need to put it together. What are the parts of that diversified mix? Some countries have gas, Trinidad, Guyana. So we haven't excluded it because we recognize this is important. And I must say that this particular diagram source is from Energy Exemplar, who developed one of the software that we're using, Plexus, to do what we call generation expansion plans. So some of the gas could be used for cooking, and some of the gas could be used for heating, depending if it's a boiler for steam in maybe a hotel. And then we use some of the gas for generating power. Now, in that same system, we may have some hydro in the system. So we need to determine what the water flow rates are. So we'll have collected that data and we'll determine how big that hydro system could be. Some could be wind, some could be solar. And then we talk about energy storage. And energy storage could take different forms. It could be batteries, it could be pump storage, it could be compressed air. So we could do different energy storage devices, and then we have what we call hydrogen, which is a new frontier, a new energy carrier that could play a part in this as well. And also, we could do what we call a combined heat and power plant, or cogeneration, or we could consider trigeneration, recognizing we have a demand profile that has multiplicity of use. We turn on lights, we need it for cooling, we need some for heating, and we need some for productive use. So one of the things about demand is that we can't ignore it at all. It is so important, and energy efficiency is going to play a critical role here. Why? Because we can use less to do more, and that is going to be very important. And one of the things that we have designed in that fit for purpose is what we call an integrated utility service model, to see how do we do things behind the meter? How do we help people to support their energy efficiency construct so that they can use less to do more? So we have our supply of fuel, so that could either be from conventional means or from renewable means, either from hydro or from renewable energies. And then we can combine heat recovery systems to make the system more efficient, and then we produce what we call the integrated resource plan. But interesting to this is our transmission and distribution. We have to get the power to the end user. So I note a number of integrated resource plan, notice I left off the resilience part, has considered only transmission. I'm going to say this to you, ladies and gentlemen. Distribution is a critical part of this mix. And let me explain why. We have created a new dimension in our transportation sector called EVs. And once that gets plugged in, that's getting plugged in on the distribution system. And we recognize this particular technology can play a role in our resilience building. And we need to understand how these DERs, I've heard some of our presenters speak about this yesterday, how these distributed energy resources are going to play a role. It could be an electric vehicle, it could be a solar, it could be wind. And we have to ensure that we can balance the act in terms of the diversification strategy. But important to this fit for purpose for your IRRP is who is responsible for what. I know in a number of markets, we are still confused in who is responsible for what. But we need to clearly define the responsibilities. We need to clearly define who is accountable. We need to clearly define who will support the activities. And we need to clearly define who will be consulted, who will be informed, and more importantly, as we have always said in the Caribbean, there's an implementation deficit. We need a strategy of how we are actually going to implement these projects once we understand what is required of us to get it done. So, our people again are required to build out the infrastructure. They're required to facilitate the discussion to ensure that the system is properly operating against all the reliability measures. And the resilience aspect is such an important part because every time we get a Sahara dust, a flood, or anything that impacts these energy systems, we have to respond through our system control to ensure that the reliability measures are still met. Persons are always getting energy at the end of the day. So what our future looks like? Our future looks very smart. It is interactive. It is operating within a communication platform so everybody knows what they're doing at any time. And the thing about a smart system of the future is going to take trust. Because as David mentioned earlier about an open source for data, this is what this is going to be. It's going to be an open source for data, secured, mind you, but an open source for data to ensure that the system can operate in a very, very optimized way. So I would like to take this opportunity for us to do these IRPs. We had to have partners. I've always mentioned this is very critical for our operations. And I think it is due respect for us to mention them here and to thank them and to also encourage them to continue with us on this part. I was just speaking to a colleague earlier, and one of the things that they proposed is that we do a regional integrated resource and resilience plan, given the mammoth of resources that we have embedded in our soils and in our ocean. From offshore wind to geothermal to hydrogen production, that we can actually work together to make this a reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gary. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm almost certain you can join me in saying that there is no absence of passion from Gary. We heard him at the closing of the opening ceremony, and we're hearing him again. So thank you very much, Gary, on behalf of the community for your passion and your dedication to addressing the issues and the challenges that this region faces. Again, just asking our friends who are following us online to please participate in the poll, which is currently running. We invite your feedback, and we also invite you to pose questions which will be answered later on when the panel discussion takes place. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome our next speaker, our final presenter for this session. He's no other than Mr. Albert Gordon. Over to you, Albert.
Good morning, everybody. Colleagues here, colleagues online, thank you very much. I'm Albert Gordon. I'm currently General Manager for the Nevis Electricity Company, NEVLEC, and just since this year, so I'm relatively new. But so far, it's been very interesting, and I must say the people of Nevis are probably as friendly as you'll find anywhere. It's a small island, the second half of St. Kitts and Nevis. We have a very small utility. The population is just about 12,000. We have 7,000 customers. And peak demand, as you would have heard yesterday, is just about 10 megawatts, a little below 10 megawatts. And we have 100% access to electricity on the island. Our system losses are among the lowest in the region, 8.5%. And sorry, the system is fairly reliable, notwithstanding certain challenges that we all face in the region. Where we do have an issue which we want to resolve is we are almost 100% dependent on diesel engines using expensive imported diesel fuel like most of our other islands. We do have a 2 megawatt wind farm. The output, however, is not always up to that level. It's an IPP, but it does contribute a portion of renewable to the energy mix. So as somebody said yesterday, you can be little but you talawa, Jamaica saying. I think this applies to Nevis probably more than most. We intend to play a major role in climate change, in fighting climate change, notwithstanding our size. So we are embarking on what we call the Nevis Island Climate Enhancement Project, or NICE project for short. And with this project, we plan not just to improve the service quality, reliability, sustainability of our own supply, and, but also to assist some of our colleague islands. And why we can do this is because of the points we have indicated here. First of all, we have very, very large renewable resources compared to our size. And so we are taking a different approach from what Dr. Jackson just mentioned in terms of our integrated resource and resilience plan. Rather than just looking at our demand and forecasting the demand, which is the traditional way, looking at our existing plans and retirement schedules, and then looking at resources and technology options, coming up with different options, and then identifying the least cost solutions, we are going to do it a little differently. If we did that, we would probably be installing just something close to 20 megawatts over the next few years just to meet our demand. We are not taking that route. What we're looking at with our NICE project is to develop our resources to supply our consumers at a reduced cost, but also to decarbonize the economy and assist other partners, neighbors, in doing the same thing for their sectors, electricity sectors, and economies. So why can we do this? We have huge renewable resources, in particular geothermal resources. We have, based on technical estimates, over 400 megawatts of renewable energy potential from geothermal. We also, like some of the other islands, and as Gareth indicated, and I will be speaking to him about some of the initiatives they have already undertaken in their country, because we are on the same path. We have offshore wind potential, which is very significant as well. And we also have onshore wind, and notwithstanding our size, we do have significant areas where we can develop solar PV. So the renewable energy resources are there, the wave energy and the tidal energy, that's also there. And so we want to develop that in a way that results in the least overall cost. So we want to optimize the development of our resources. Of course, size does matter, as Angela said yesterday, and so we want to scale up in order to benefit from the economies of scale, which will reduce the cost to consumers. And so based on that, we have to go well beyond our existing demand. And in that respect, we are looking to export energy, and this can be in the form of direct connections through electrical cables, as Gareth indicated they have done, and also through the production of hydrogen and derivatives of hydrogen, which could be ammonia or even green fertilizer. Because once you have hydrogen, you combine that with nitrogen from the atmosphere, you have ammonia, and that can be also used to produce fertilizer. Once you have hydrogen as well, you can produce other synthetic fuels and methanol and so on. So that provides us with the opportunity to take advantage of the global move to fight climate change by producing green energy for export to our neighbors. Aside from that, we're also looking, because we have all the different varieties of renewables essentially available to us, we are looking to provide some area for research and development, for experimentation. And indeed, we have been talking to some manufacturers already. For example, one particular manufacturer of diesel engines, and they are now producing diesel engines that run on ammonia, which is going to be used in the shipping industry to decarbonize that sector. We are working with them to do some of the field testing for those generators on the island. So as we produce our own ammonia, we could be using similar diesel engines to produce electricity using this renewable fuel. So we'll be part of the experimentation and improvement of that technology going forward. Likewise, we are speaking with manufacturers of electrolyzers, which will be critical in the production of hydrogen. The way that works is we use the electricity to essentially split the hydrogen water molecule into hydrogen and oxygen, and that process is electrolysis. And there are different types of technologies that are emerging: alkaline, PEM, proton exchange membrane. But one of the ones we find very interesting for us is the solid oxide cells, whether it's for electrolysis or fuel cells. So we are talking to one of the manufacturers, in fact, a research company out of Germany that is leading that charge. And there is a certain synergy between that and geothermal power. So we're looking to do some research pilot projects on the island using solid oxide cells. So the NICE project that we are pursuing. We are doing it in 3 large phases relative to our system. And within these phases, there are stages that we'll be developing the project in. And so the first phase is to develop a 30 megawatt geothermal project. Now, as I said, this could be in stages. We'll probably start with smaller units and then go up to 30. But why we want to go to 30 initially, that's to cover the base load for St. Kitts and Nevis by that year. And that 30 megawatt plant will be developed at our entry site, which I'll show shortly. But in addition to that, we're going to develop a transmission system to complement the existing distribution network. Right now, on both islands, we have generating stations that produce at 11 kV and essentially distribute the power directly from the generators. So there's no high voltage system to bulk transfer the power. So we're going to start that and also include an interconnection with St. Kitts. Although we're very close, the 2 systems are not interconnected. Once we are interconnected, that will improve the resilience of both systems. We can back up each other. And so we're looking to take this high voltage. We're looking at 33 or 66 kV. There are some studies going on now. Gary mentioned the Integrated Resource Plan. We're actually working with CCRE and CDB and the IDB to develop such a plan now. So that will fine-tune the NICE project to some extent. So we'll finalize whether it's 66 or 33. Right now we're looking 66 because we expect to become a major hub on Nevis for renewable energy production and export. But in terms of the interconnect, we may go down to 33. On St. Kitts also, they would have to develop a similar transmission system so that we can exchange power more freely. We're looking at battery energy storage, and the 15 megawatt there is the maximum would go up to per system, and we have also set that for our generating units. We can go down as low as 5, but we want to have an upper limit based on what we expect the system to ultimately be, because we don't want units to be too large. So the battery energy storage system will be there as a stabilizing force. It's not for long-term storage at this stage, so the amount of energy it will be storing will be like 1 hour or half an hour. That will be there to ensure that should a large unit trip, the system is not disturbed and you have some time to bring up other units. And since we're planning to go bigger in order to get the power cheaper, that is important for us. While we're doing that also, we will be reconfiguring the distribution network. So now having a transmission network, you will want to have substations, and rather than have the distribution feeders emanating from just one point, which is the case now for both St. Kitts and Nevis, we'll be able to feed distribution lines which will be shorter from substations around the islands. That will reduce losses further and also improve the reliability and resilience of the overall system. Finally, digitalization, as you heard, it's important, data is important. So we are moving to digitalize the existing system, collect more data, be able to provide more predictive maintenance, and again, improve the resilience and reliability of the system. So this is what the phase 1 system will look like. As you notice, the transmission network, as we indicated, will have loops in it for redundancy. So any major component goes out, it will not disturb the system. Consumers will not even know that, right? The N1 site, as we have shown here, that's where we will start off with the 30 megawatts. And the largest unit sizes will be 15 megawatts, as I indicated earlier. And this will essentially cover the western side of the island. And what is not very clear, we have the links to St. Kitts, and we plan to have 2 high voltage links and 1 low voltage link to across the shortest point, where we can meet their demand at the end of the peninsula better than them. I took out that map because of the size of the presentation. So right now, all the generators are at Prospect. We will develop the 30 megawatts connected to Prospect, where we have the existing infrastructure to distribute the line. But then we'll have the transmission lines that will be in place to allow us to transmit power around the island as well as across to St. Kitts. For phase 2, we will further expand the geothermal. Having met the base load for both islands now, we're looking to export. So the first stage, meet the local demand in Nevis and St. Kitts. Later on, reduce the cost. The answer to your survey, it's all of the above and more as far as we are concerned. So we're looking to address all of those. Reduce costs, decarbonize, increase reliability, provide jobs, and so on. So for the second stage, we're going to do what we call the Power to X, which means we're going to be producing hydrogen and derivatives from hydrogen. And of course, I want to mention the experimentation that we'll be doing. So we'll be using the existing plant, which has some very old generators. We'll be retiring some of those, and that's where we will be doing the experimentation with some of the diesels on ammonia, and those can be as backup as well to the geothermal plant. I also want to mention building capacity in the region and locally. It's a very strong objective for us, so that's one of the other objectives from renewables, and we want to develop the technical capacity in terms of renewables, the special technologies, geothermal, all the different technologies, wind, solar, tidal wave. We want to look at those. So we'll be working with SICRI, UE, and some external institutions to develop a training institute on the island. Why? Because we have all the different resources there. We see all the different issues with climate change. We have a rainforest, notwithstanding our size, so we can study all these things in the context of climate change. And so this is what phase 2 will involve. Essentially, we'll bring in the Power to X, so we'll be producing hydrogen through electrolysis there. And you notice we have already secured land or identified land in that area owned by the government. We are located close to the port, so we can export the hydrogen and derivatives from hydrogen. And the final phase is we will expand further. Again, this could be in stages, but we hope to accomplish all of this by 2030. So we would develop the geothermal resource further to a total of 90 megawatts. Remember, the potential is up to over 400 megawatts, but we want to monitor that first, ensure sustainability. And then we also want to start the offshore wind. So we think we could do 50 megawatts. And and based on that now, this is all additional power that we have above our local demand. So we'll expand the Power to X facility and start to look at related developments such as green industrial parks, transshipment for ammonia, and so on. And of course, while doing this, we are integrating what we're doing, because this is a game changer for the island and for the country, with the other sectors in the economy. So transportation, as you heard, electric vehicles. We'll be able to support both battery electric vehicles and fuel cell electric vehicles, which use hydrogen. So we'll be, we could support both of those. Tourism, direct use of some of the geothermal fluids for spas and so on, but also in terms of ensuring tourism is essentially going to be green. All the energy requirements will be provided from renewables. Agriculture and water supply. Gary showed this curve, which is typical of pretty much all the islands. And one of the things we're looking at is to produce desalinated water, because there's a problem with availability of potable water on most of our islands. And to do probably a little pump storage in the off-peak period, you know, where we store the water at high levels and gravity feed to consumers later on. And so finally, this is what we hope to look like by 2030. So we'll have our 45 megawatts at N3, 45 megawatts at N1 of geothermal base load capacity. And this is much better than wind and solar, because it is base load. Expected availability is over 97%. percent and capacity factor somewhere around that level as well. So it will be running all the time. These types of plants tend to be more reliable than others. So that will be a good backbone for the rest of the system. We'll have a robust transmission network in place. We are hoping to get some of this underground, but underground systems tend to be more expensive, so that depends on the type of financing we get. But for increased resilience, we want to get some of these underground. And then, of course, we want to look at the offshore wind, and that will complement the geothermal. And what we haven't shown yet, down this area has very good solar intensity, so we'll look at solar power as well. And you'll notice I indicate some hotels popping up around there. We plan to work with developers to develop these hotels in synergy with what we're doing, so that the tourism sector, which is one of the main sectors for Nevis, can prosper. And down here, just to point out again, eventually we'll build out into an industrial park. So that's the path we're on, where we are. Phase one, we have identified the financing in terms of an equity partner. So there's a public-private partnership for the development of the first phase, and we are actively working with CDB for the debt. We expect that will come through. So we hope to start drilling of production wells for phase one in the first quarter of next year, and then we'll continue from there. Hopefully by 2030, we'll be in this position to not only decarbonize our local economy and meet our demand reliably and cheaply, but to also assist other neighboring islands in achieving similar objectives. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Albert. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we've now come to, Albert was our last speaker, so we've now come to the end of the presentations, but this will be followed immediately by a panel discussion. So can I please ask the panelists to please join us on stage? They are already here. And for those of you online, you can also ask your questions by paying attention to that button on the right side of your screen, Ask the Speaker. There you can ask your questions, and those questions will be answered. I also want to invite you to please consider participating in the poll. You can access the next question, which is: how important is integrated resource and resilience planning to the investment framework that is required for the energy transition in CARICOM countries? You have a number of possible responses. The first one is, it is critically important. The second, it is very important. The third, it is moderately important. The last, it is not important. And don't feel shy if you don't have sufficient information upon which to select an option. You can also indicate that you are not sure. This has been a very captivating set of presentations, ladies and gentlemen, and may I invite you now to engage the panelists. If you have any questions online, we have support where those questions will be read to the panelists. And if there are no questions, then I shall be making questions up as we go along. Over to our support team for posing the questions raised online.
Thank you, Dr. Alexis. We have one question from for the panel, and it's actually related to our poll question. So how can countries fund an exercise like an IRRP, considering that this is an iterative process?
I didn't hear the question fully.
Who wishes to take that question?
Could you repeat the question? Could you repeat it?
Can you repeat the
Yes.
question, please?
Not a problem. How can countries fund an exercise like the IRRP, considering that this is an iterative process?
Okay.
Any takers?
Sure. I guess
Yes?
I would have to start.
Gary? Gary's
All
going
right.
to start us off.
Thank you very much for that question. So right now we are, and you notice in my presentation, I had to say thank you to partners because we have been getting resources from a number of our from the international community to support the IRRP. Now, the Caribbean Development Bank definitely has an interest in supporting the IRPs going forward. And the reason for that is to the question the DSG had said on the poll, is that it will help with investment. So I'm hoping that most of the participants answered it's critical, because this is why it is critical. It's going to drive investment, so we know what type of assets will be required across the network to create a reliable, sustainable energy sector. So right now we are working with our development partners, CDB being one of them, to support countries, and we will do it with you. You would have noted that Albert mentioned about capacity building. One of the things that we are doing is that we are encouraging countries to participate in the capacity building, because we want to help you to interrogate these models yourselves so you can know what the next tranche of assets that you may want to look at into the future. Thank you.
Thanks. And Gary, can I ask you perhaps to just expound a little on that issue, in the absence, of course, of David. David raised the issue of access to data. How does the current situation with data affect the ability of whether it is the agencies that are supporting the work or the countries that will be doing the IRP? What are your concerns around data access, data management, and the democratization of data in relation to that?
Very, very good and interesting point. Data is a challenge and a very important part for the IRP to be successful. One of the things I can say, though, is that there is a degree of maybe uncertainty of some of the member states. When you start looking at data and you understand the data, you're kind of peeling away an onion, and you kind of understand there's a vulnerability aspect. Mm-hmm. And sometimes countries or utilities may not want you to see too much of what they are made of. And sometimes that gets a little scary for them. But we do sign what we call non-disclosure agreements for them to have some comfort. But notwithstanding that, sometimes there are data gaps in the systems, and part of that is because of some capacity issues. And I think as we move through the process, we'll be helping to build strengthen that capacity through networks, through communication, through our IT infrastructure, and also through capacity building for the individuals. So we believe over time we will get to a point where data and data collection will no longer be an issue. But right now there are some challenges, and we're hoping to overcome that in the future. Thanks.
Thank you. I know Gareth wants to come in, but Gareth, when you come in, also help us. You're an islander, not a Caribbean islander, but you are an islander. Is data an issue in Orkney?
Absolutely, and I was wanting to share with you that what you're describing there is exactly the kind of issues we're having to face, amongst our communities. And I think there's two things that I would point out. One is that data is effectively, for some people, a key asset. We talk about money and how do we get money to invest in something, but without data and information, there's nothing to invest in. So I think that too often we actually undervalue the data holders compared to the money holders. And maybe what we need to do is make sure that there's an integrity around, if you like, the intellectual market for data, which doesn't mean that people become protective of it. But it does mean that as we share data between different users, the people who've originated that data and the custodians of it get some reward for that. Because otherwise the data creators are just, they're kind of, they're denuded of any value from the data, so that in the future they won't produce it. So that's about creating value and being fair about where data comes from. I think the other thing I'd observe is that, and actually I'm thinking of COVID here, is that if we look at the amount of data and information that's being shared collectively about COVID, because it was a health crisis, it was a threat, an imminent threat, that's maybe a model we need to think about, because we can all say climate change is an even bigger threat than COVID is. And yet we're still getting possessive about it. We're still saying, well, we want to be first, we want to be biggest, we want to be best, instead of collectively we need to beat this thing. Climate change is infinitely more challenging than COVID. So let's have that collective effort where some of those barriers get broken down. So I don't think those two things are in conflict. I think we need to value the data providers, the people that create information, but we need to be willing to share it and collaborate on that as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, you want to come in, Albert?
Yes, thank you. So there are two big issues with data, as far as I can see. One is that a lot of times there is data, it is being collected, but as I think David mentioned, it is not being stored in a way where it can be easily accessed, analyzed, and managed. And so that is one thing that has to be addressed, and a lot of time that relates to our existing system. In doing an IRP, you need data on demand, you need data on your existing system, and you need data on your resources. So a lot of times we are collecting some of this data, but it's just being collected for the sake of collection, not being analyzed or utilized in planning. One of the things we are doing at NEVLEC is we are implementing a business intelligence system, which will allow us to pull data from different databases and put it in a format that we can make sense of that. And we have found that very useful so far, for example, in outages. We collect information on every single outage and so on, but if you want to analyze it from the perspective of a feeder or a type of outage and so on, it's impossible to do based on how we had it. With the business intelligence system, you can easily drill down wherever you want in terms of finding the root cause for a particular outage. The other major issue would be areas where we are not collecting information, for example, on resources. So say on wind resource and so on, if you want to include wind technology in your plans, you need to have specific local information to be able to inform that analysis. So we do need to collect more, but what we are collecting now, we need the systems in place to better manage those. Mm-hmm. The issue of hoarding and not sharing is something we really have to get past. You know, some people think if they hold on to the data, it's valid to them, but what I find sharing and interacting is good. And I'm happy to say Carelec is introducing a benchmarking program where we're collecting data and all the utilities are calculating KPIs and making that available to the different utilities, protecting confidentiality where necessary.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Any more questions online?
We have one question that was directed at Mr. Farrell, but I'm going to just adapt it slightly. What is the predicted climate change impact on hydropower and solar power potential for the region? Droughts on one hand and rainy days on the other, leading to less sunlight.
Okay, so David is not here, so who can stand in and answer this question?
Well, the only thing I can say for that is that as we do the IRRPs, that is what David Shop is going to be providing us, so that we can understand what and the University of the West Indies Climate Group. So David has given us seasonal and sub-seasonal activities or events, while the UWI Climate Group is giving us long-term impact. So we're using that to make a determination of what the system will look like in the short term, medium term, and long term in terms of generating our production capacities. Interestingly, that the person asked that question because we have seen that impact. So David would have shared with us at the SECRE when they had the Sahara dust and when they had the volcanic ash in Barbados with some of the production levels of the solar systems. And we saw the drop-off was significant, which would have meant that other generating capacities that are conventional that uses fossil fuel would have to pick up the slack. Bearing in mind that those conventional systems also are impacted because they need to have proper cooling systems, and these particular dust particulates also impact those cooling systems. So it's a double-edged sword that you have to manage in your operations. Belize had a similar situation. They had droughts. They have a lot of hydros, maybe up to 60% of their capacity. And they had to do export from Mexico. Now, luckily for Belize, they are interconnected to Central America. But if they were not interconnected, then they would have had to have other generating capacities to support the reliability of that system.
Gary, since you're on the floor, I want to ask a question that would relate to every single one of the panelists, but let me start with you. And it relates as well to the issue I think you started your presentation with in terms of stakeholder engagement. we are in a region where there seems to be a disconnect between institutions and the people, institutions and civil society. And we understand that stakeholder engagement is an important element of the work that we do. And therefore, what strategies can we deploy to ensure that, and I'm going to be a bit all-inclusive here, every man, woman, and child of the Caribbean knows what we're doing in relation to renewable energy, in relation to sustainable development, in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals. How do we do it from the perspective of your agency, from the perspective of CARICOM, from the perspective of the national institutions?
All right, so how we have started, and you know, DSG, you have raised a very important point because we are all a part of the solution. So people have to have the information. But what we have started to do, and this is in collaboration with CARICOM, we have established what we call a CARICOM Energy Knowledge Hub. And within that hub, we have created an environment for different persons, for different sectors, for the utilities, for children, for typical civil society to be engaged in this virtual space as well. We have engaged in our secondary schools, so we have engaged the CXC to make this a part of their syllabus in terms of green engineering, in terms of some of the environment that we want the students to understand. And we believe that the conversion is going to be in the youth. So we are asking them to take that information back to their parents to kind of create what we call an infiltration into the knowledge that we share with them. So that's one aspect of it, but we understand that it's a mammoth task, and I think all of us would have a role to play in that regard.
And maybe you know, the institution that nationals love to hate is the electricity company. So how do you deal with that in Nevis?
Yeah, I'll tell you, but just two quick comments follow up on the question earlier. For hydro, Gary mentioned Belize, which has a dam for their hydro. Most of our systems are run off the river. And so if we are having drier periods and heavier rainfalls, that's exactly not suitable for that, because during the dry period, obviously you're not getting any power. And when you get heavy rains, you get floods and siltation and so on. So climate change will affect the hydro. On the solar, recently we see what hurricanes have done to some of the solar PV systems, essentially. So we have to design for Category 5 hurricanes for PV, which would cost more, and that is not possible. And in terms of consultation, it's very critical, and you have to engage the public from the beginning of the project and be very open, and also in soliciting their feedback. Make sure you are taking them seriously and building them into the design of your project. So if there are good suggestions, you need to incorporate those. You probably also need to address the public generally, but also specific stakeholders, not just to let them know what you're doing to mitigate any adverse impacts, but to explain the particular opportunities. Like, for example, would engage the tourism industry specifically to say this is possible, or agriculture and so on. But full engagement, open transparency, not trying to keep anything secret from the public, I think is the best approach.
Great. And
yeah, I think adding, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think one of the other things that we need to appreciate is energy is a two-ended proposition. So we talk a lot about how we generate energy and the organization of where energy is going to come from. But to answer your question, we also need to address how we as citizens use energy.
yeah.
And I think that engagement process is something that we've started to address I mentioned in the Reflex project, where we're encouraging citizens to become members of the energy system, not just consumers of energy. So it's going beyond just the monetary transaction. And one of the tools that we've used to engender that is to create a carbon budget for an individual or for a household. So there are carbon calculators that are on the web, and I'm sure many of us that are in the sector have had a look at them. But what's interesting is that they're tools that are very average. They don't really suit island situations, for example, because they ignore boats or air travel that we might use for work, and they just look at holidays. So what we've done in Orkney is we've created a carbon calculator that specifically looks at domestic and business use in the islands. And through that, we're getting people taking interest. Well, look, this is my contribution that I'm making. What can I do to change that, and how does that relate to the services that are available? So I think we need to obviously consult and be free with our information, but we need to find a way of getting citizens actually engaged themselves. And you know, as you said, every man, woman and child, that is a big challenge. But unless we start and move at it, we're never going to do it. So
Yep.
Step by step.
Great. Thank you for those responses. Any more questions from our online participants?
Yes, we do have another question. This one actually focuses on the idea of institutionalization. Recognizing that for implementation to be successful, there must be consistency. What are the measures that are in place for mitigating any potential changes that may occur when there's a change in government?
That is an interesting one. Let's see who is willing to take this one on.
I'm sorry to be laughing, but
A very important one, but interesting as well.
I think most of these issues and the solutions are national and indeed regional. Gary mentioned we talk about doing IRP for the region as a whole rather than just individual countries. So I was the one who he was referring to then. And similarly, locally, in coming up with these, you need to engage all parties across party lines, right? So if everybody is involved and the views of all stakeholders, including those who may be of different visions, are included, then you come up with national solutions. If you try to come up with party solutions and politicize the solution, then we have a problem. So I think focusing on national and the idea is regional solutions and getting commitments to get those done will help with that. Another aspect is where possible if you have institutions that are relatively independent, such as utility regulators who are supposed to be independent. So if we allow the independence and allow decisions that are of a technical nature relative to the utilities to be taken at that level within the context of policy decisions, then that is also good. So I like to think you should separate policy from regulation, from operations. So if we can do that, then the best projects will be implemented in the best ways without any undue interference.
I want to posit perhaps just a sort of a connection to this question, and that is the issue of maybe the absence of long-term national development plans, whether these are driven by considerations of climate change or considerations of economic development and advancement, but the absence of long-term development plans, which therefore makes political manifestos the development plan of the country, which then links to the question that was asked in terms of change of government. To what extent do you perhaps think that it is time for us as a region to begin thinking in terms of a 2050 national development plan for country X, which would then allow you to buffer changes in the democratic process. It's a democratic process which results in the change of governments in this region, and that has to be embraced. But we also have to ensure that the long-term development trajectory of the member state does not get affected by a change of government.
Yeah.
Yes.
Maybe to come in a little bit here as well is that I think we need to be clear about the role that government plays in that whole process. I don't think I've ever encountered a government in the world who actually hold the vision part of it. That tends to come from the professionals that are involved in the energy sector. And governments get advice from people to help create the vision. Now, what we've seen in the UK and in Orkney is that as we've gained expertise, and I see this happening in the Caribbean where you get centres of excellence being created across the region, those centres of excellence become the place where vision starts to be created. The role of government is then to create the policy and the implementation of the vision.
Yeah.
And I think that what we've seen is that there are clearly places which we call them lighthouse communities. There are communities that go ahead of the curve, and they're the ones that really shine a light that other people can follow. So we need to recognize where those beacons of light are in Europe, in the Caribbean, and then build a vision around that then people can coalesce around. And I think, as was said earlier, depoliticizing it, making sure that actually we don't look for a quick fix on a party political role, but we engage the whole of the governance structure to say, what's the solution we need over the next 10 or 20 years, not over the next 5.